in our time together today, we have just, I think, one slide left in the slide deck Introduction to ABAP that we need to talk through because it has some important content for us. And then after that, we will jump into our next topic together where we start talking about syntactic elements in the ABAP programming language. So without further ado, in the context of Introduction to ABAP, if I jump here to kicking off point slide number 26 and get my computer set up here. So we had a quiz question about activation, and you read about activation, but we did not talk about it at length. You got the opportunity to do activation of a program in the lab work that you just completed. But let's make sure that we understand the logistics here, because this is an area where we could potentially trip ourselves up in our thought process here. When you write an ABAP program, we observe that the work that you are doing in the editor, first of all, is not automatically saved. You have to hit the save icon for it to be saved. And when you hit the saved icon, you are saving it, well, quite frankly, I don't know exactly where you're saving it at that point, but what you're not doing is you're not putting it in the program repository. You're saving it in some kind of intermediate location. And so when you engage in direct processing, you are actually running the program as it sits at that moment in your editor. That is distinct from the version of the program that may be in the program repository. Now notice this. So you have your program as it exists in the editor. You have a version of your program in the program repository, but not active when you save the program. So if you will, at this point, you have one version of your program that's in, we'll say, the IDE in transaction SE80. And then potentially you have a version of your program in a second location that is saved. So it's in the program repository, but it's not been activated. So it's an inactive version of the program. So when a program is saved, it goes into the program repository as an inactive object. Inactive objects cannot be transported and can't be run by other users on the system. Now, this is particularly important for you to keep in mind, because in upcoming programming assignments, I will run test your programs. I won't make you install them as transaction codes like we did for the last lab, but I will run test them. When I run test them, since I am not you, I run whatever version of your program has been activated, which means that if you have made changes to your program and saved it and run it by way of direct processing and say, hey, it works great, I'm good, but you forget to activate it, I will not be running the same version of the program that you are running, which seems like a recipe for losing points on your homework. So you want to be careful about that. Activating a program subjects it to a final validity check, and if it passes the validity check, it will go into the program repository in an activated state. So really, you could kind of think of a program as potentially existing in three different potential states. The active version that you are working on in SE80 that has not yet been saved, the version that gets saved when you press the save option that goes into the program repository is inactive, and then when you activate it, the activated version in the program repository. Now, sometimes you may have this happen to you in the future. You're working along on your computer, and maybe you're working on Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi drops, or your system crashes, or something like that. And so you log back into the system, and what you will often see, and I'm sure we'll see this at some point this semester, is the system will ask you what version of the program do you want it to retrieve? And so you'll have the option of saying, well, give me what I was last working on, or give me the last activated version. And we'll see that, I'm sure, at some point, and you may see that in your workflow as well. So it's important for us to realize this kind of segregation of locations and versions of our program. It's why, if you're not careful, you can get yourself confused. And so understanding this is important for our not having that happen. If the program source code is further edited and saved, this work in progress is the same as an inactivated program. When the version is activated, it takes the place of the program. So the idea, you start writing a program, you save it, so that goes here into state 2. Well, then you decide to make some changes, so now version 1 and version 2 are different until you hit the save key again. And then once you hit the save key and activate it, you check your source code here into the program repository, but maybe you start editing it again. So now you're back here into state 1. So you kind of have to mentally make sure that you put some thought into, okay, which version of this is. Because I've had students before they go nuts, they run it in their IDE and it looks great, and then they run it on the system in a different way and they get different output. And they've forgotten the distinction here between which version of the program is used in which situation. As we've observed, and we had a quiz question about, activated programs may be run by other system users and may be installed as transactions. You saw that in your homework. And then lastly, as we will later see, things other than programs are activated. And a single program may have really a whole collection of things to be activated. I think as early as our next discussion, we'll start talking about text pools. And you'll see where items in what's called the text pool get activated in addition to the primary program that the text pool is related to. So this will come up a lot. Yes?
Is this kind of similar to it, where you check you're working on your local version, check it in, and everybody can see it, and you can convert it to master?
Conceptually, yes. It's not, unfortunately, it doesn't have the robustness of versioning or, checking in and checking out, or allowing code to be easily shared amongst a team. So it lacks those more advanced features, but it does have some similarity in regards to distinct versions being in place. We've made reference on this slide to the repository. Let's talk about that for just a second as our last point in this discussion. Everything that we do in development will eventually go into this repository. That's where programs go. If we write functions that are standalone, they go into the repository. When we define a database table, that goes into the repository. When we create ABAP objects in the context of object-oriented programming, that goes into the repository. So the repository is this kind of massive system resource where all of the things that are used in development and execution of the system are stored. So what we see here is the repository contains a mixture of things that SAP has created and things that we have created. So once again, this is why we have to be very, very careful about name collision. Because if I create something with a particular name and check it into the repository, I could potentially overwrite something that's already there. And that's probably not going to be a very, very good thing to have happen. You do get some system protection, like we observed last time. If you try and create something that doesn't begin with the letters Y or Z, the system will warn you. But if you create something that does begin with a Y or Z and happens to collide name-wise with another system resource, and you're not paying close attention, you can wipe out something else. So be cognizant of that opportunity. There is the repository information system that allows us to search within The repository, the repository information system can be accessed in SE80 by, and that's interesting, my laptop displays the dimensions of certain things differently. So let me see if I can solve that. This right here, this panel, actually when you click on it, should have a whole bunch of things that come up or down. And for whatever reason, that panel, I can't make it bigger. So you may see that on your system where this actually, if you click on it, shows you some other options. That would be, if I could get it to work right now, a way that we could access the repository browser. Or there's a standalone transaction, SE84, that brings me into the repository browser. And so this gives me a way to drill down and look at the program library, the ABAP dictionary, the class library, all kinds of other objects that are in the system can be accessed through this particular transaction code. I don't know that we'll do much in SE84, although we will call up resources in the development workbench as the semester proceeds. The SE80 provides us with an object navigator, and that's what we call this particular portion of the screen right here, where you say, okay, I want to find a program, and you could key in a program name. Notice right here that I have this set to package, and I've put a package in here. I could alternately change this to program and put in the name of a program. And we looked at this earlier in the semester, I think on day 1, where now I've just called up a program in the system. So the idea is, depending upon what I put here for my selector and what I put in the box underneath it, will determine what's actually pulled out of the repository for the sake of me being able to work with. So you'll get a lot of practice this semester in that regard, in pulling things out of, and for some reason, there we go. Here's the program that we created together. All right, any questions about any of that before we wrap up this first discussion? All right, well, I am now very eager and excited for the next thing that we get to do, because we're actually going to start learning about the ABAP programming language itself. So give me a few moments here to get some things reorganized, and we will start into our second discussion here on ABAP programming concepts. We will this semester leverage the fact that you are not novice programmers, and so we'll talk about a lot of syntactical elements, but there will be a lot of things, particularly as we go along, where we'll say, okay, this is just like something that you've already done in another programming language, and so we won't talk about all of the basic stuff. We'll just kind of jump in, presuming that you have the foundational knowledge that all of you have. And we'll definitely highlight the things in ABAP that are somewhat unique. In your very first program that you wrote, you got the opportunity to create output. As the semester goes on, we will discover there are a few different ways that we can put stuff on the screen. But the most common method of output, which is called list-related output, employs the write statement. And once again, that's what you got to use for homework when you wrote a little hello world type program. And the syntax here, the statement begins with the keyword write. We place inside of single quotes the character string literal that we want to output if we are in fact writing out a character literal. We'll talk about writing out data objects or variables here shortly, and we'll observe how those work, but then period at the end of the sentence. Notice a couple of things. Remember, we observed that in ABAP, all of our language elements except for string literals, which are painted to the screen, are commonly written in all capital letters. In the first lab, you should have set up your pretty printer to automatically make that conversion for you. So make sure that you do that in the final version of your source code. And note here, of course, the use of single quotes for writing output. And the idea here is, in this case, the word hello is going to be written to the current cursor location. So in the program that we have in the background here that we worked with previously, you'll see that this mirrors what you have on the slide that we were looking at a moment ago. And so when this program runs, the word hi just shows up basically row 1, column 1, right there at the top of the output screen. Well, what are other options available to us? And I'll say, notice, not exhaustive. I'm not going to go through all of the different ways the write statement can be used so that you can explore some of them on your own, but we'll hit the highlights of some of the more important ones here. Suppose I want to position where my output goes. If I put a / after the write statement, and notice there's a space after the word write, and then there's a slash, and then there's a space, and then there's my text literal here, this is going to move the cursor to the beginning of the next line. But notice this little provision, if there has been previous output. So if I go back to the program that we have loaded up, and you'll kind of have to watch here real carefully, you see when I run it, you see where hi shows up here. If I change this to introduce the slash, and I'm in overtype mode, let me fix that. Okay, so I've introduced the slash, and now I run it, and you notice hi shows up in the same place. That's because that slash only causes me to go to the next line if there has been something written there. So if I were to add a second line of code and now do hi again, we'll in fact see that that does cause the hi again to go to the beginning of the next line. So one of the things to file away in the back of your brain is sometimes we set up a loop construct, and inside of the loop we have a write statement, and we want, of course, not to write everything to just one big old line of code. We want every iteration to write its own line. We can go ahead and put this in our loop, and it won't give us an extra line, blank line at the top, because the very first time it writes it out, it'll say, oh, I haven't written anything out yet, so let's just ignore that slash there. And then the second and third and fourth time through, it will go ahead and do the going to the next line, like what we're observing here in our output window. Well, moving right ahead, write, and in this case, I've just arbitrarily picked the number 5, hello. And in this case, the cursor gets moved to the 5th column. And so hello will be written to that current cursor location. Now, you have to be kind of careful with this one if you're not paying attention, because I have done this before. Let's say I write hi, and I say put that in column 20, and then I come down here, and I put in column 10, write hello. Okay, who can tell me what's going to happen here? It's not going to go to the next line. So it's going to jump over to column 20 and write the word hi. And then on that same line, it's going to jump to column 10 and write the word hello, giving me that. Okay? So realize, unless I tell it to go to the next line with a slash, it's not going to automatically go there. And when I do these column positionings, I have to be careful, because I have done stuff like this. And this is always really fun because this is the kind of stuff that drives you bonkers, where we say write 10 hi, write 10 hello, and what am I going to see on the screen? The word hello, because hi gets overwritten, okay? And so when we're doing, this is very, very useful when you want to build like a grid output and want to create columns. This will give us a way to do it, but we've got to be very, very careful with where we put slashes in to go to the next line, and then where we put things. You know, here in this situation, I have to give thought to how many characters long my output is, exactly where I want things to go, and so on. Write, notice here, /5 hello. Well, this is just a combination of the two things that I mentioned previously. And notice my spacing here. It's write space /5, no space between those, space hello. Now, this is the kind of thing that as I'm typing source code together with you in class, I will undoubtedly mess this up a few hundred times this semester, and you will likely do the same in your coding. So the point is, you just want to be aware of this and try and catch yourself from making this particular error. But let's see here. Oh, look at that. We talked before about the SAP GUI crashing and what happens when that happens. And in fact, my SAP GUI did just crash. So let's hope this doesn't happen to us a lot this semester. See if I can get it back, but I don't think I can. Nope. Let's see what happens when oh, that worked. Restore. All right, so notice here now if I do write /10 and then run this, I get this right here. So this goes back to what I was saying about how we can put things in columns. This is one technique we could use for that. The other thing that we can do if we want to put things in columns is we can do something like this. Write, and then whatever it is that we want to write, under, and then a name of another data object here. So the idea here is we're going to write item X. We're going to a new line, okay? So the slash there takes us to the new line. We're going to write whatever the output is, and really there should be a space between my slash and the X there. So if you're writing that down or annotating your slides, make note of that, under Y. So let's look at what we're talking about here. We could do something like write out hi, and then I could do write /hello under, under hi. Okay, so let's observe what happens in this situation. And so you'll notice it has put hello underneath the word hi, but in my source code, I did not specify that particular column number. Now, what's the utility of this? Can I tell me where this might be useful? Let's say I'm building a table of output, and it relates to airplane flight schedules. And so I have city from, I have a city to, and let's say I have the miles between them. And so I output these as headers. And so maybe I put this in column 5, and this in column 20, and this in column 40. Okay? So I write that line out, specifying those column numbers, and then on lines that follow, I write slash whatever under city from. And so it gives me alignment. The nice thing about this is, after I write my program and I have the table up there, if I say, you know, I don't like the way that's spaced. I'm going to move city 2 to column 17 instead of column 20. I just changed the line that outputs what we'll call the header, and everything else, because it's based on that line, will line up just as I desire it to do so. Yes, sir?
What if you have more than one instance of I?
Yeah, that's not going to work then. So we have to be careful about stuff like that.
Do nothing, or it'll do both,
My guess is it'll pick one of them, but I don't know what rules it's going to use to pick. Now, what we will often do is all I'm showing you at the moment is things that are string literals. Sometimes this will be output of data objects. And so this might be var1, var2, var3. And so we don't have that ambiguity there. We just say put this under var1, put this under var2, and so on. Okay. Continuing on with the write statement. Suppose I want to control, the last slide talked about where stuff was put. Now let's talk about the length of what gets written out. If I put a number in parentheses and follow it with, in this case, a string literal, but this same technique would work with numbers, the output is confined to the number of characters that are there in between those parentheses. Now, if it's a string and that results in part of the string being chopped off, so be it. Nothing happens in the output other than, in this case, HEL is going to be written to output. If what I was writing out was a number, and so let's say the number was 174,219, and I said, write that number out 3. Well, it's going to say, okay, I guess you know what you're doing. So it's only going to write it out for 3 characters, but to show that this isn't really a true number output that's accurate, what it's going to do is, notice the left part of the number is going to be truncated and a star is going to be made part of the output to show that the number was truncated. So we'll run some code that shows this in a moment, but I don't remember if it's going to write out star 19 or if it's going to write out 19 star. But it's going to chop off. It will only give me 3 characters of output, but in the case of a number, it's going to use a star to show truncation. So let's come back here and let's say, notice here, if I said write out high, 10 characters wide, well, there's no problem there because high will fit 10 characters wide. But then if I did this, write out 2 characters wide, hello, under high, you might notice, and I think I have this later on the slide, if you look real closely, my left parenthesis turned red, which indicates a syntax error, and that tells me that not supposed to be a space there. So now when I run this, notice what I get. I get high E, okay? No indication that anything has been truncated, but hello got chopped down to just 2 characters. So, output control. Now this one you will see the utility of later on in our discussion and in code we write. But the star outputs whatever we have asked the write statement to output in a field of sufficient size without internal space padding, but with space left between data objects. Okay, there's lots of things in that statement that let's talk about here for a second. So it's going to write out in a field of sufficient size without internal space padding. You will see later on that we can create decimal numbers where we can control how many digits are stored for that decimal number. So let's say I created a decimal number that match the pattern that I just put here on the whiteboard. And I stored in that the number 14.2. Well, what's going to happen when that gets written to the screen? All of these are going to be spaces. So it's going to actually write out to the screen space, 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 14.2 space, space. That's what I would get by default because of the size of this number. But you say, I don't want all this extra space junk here. Okay, that's what the star does for you. A star in parentheses will take what you have and output it without any external characters. Similarly, if I create a character string of size, I don't know, however many underlines I just put here, and I store the word hi in it and write that out, I'm going to get space, 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 hi, which I don't want. So the star in parentheses kills off those extra spaces. Now, what about that thing, though, about space left between data objects? What's something interesting that ABAP does that most programming languages would not do? Write hi, write hello. Now, if you think about if you did the equivalent of this in Java or PHP or most programming languages, you would have written to the screen HIHELLO with no space between hi and hello, right? You've undoubtedly had to write things in your code to like put spaces between things when you're outputting them. ABAP does not require you to do that. ABAP will automatically spot you a space between data objects when you are writing them out. So that's kind of nice. That in most instances is what we want to have happen. So notice the star doesn't change that. If I were to come back here and say write out hi with as few characters as you need, and then write out hello with as few characters as is absolutely needed, I still get that blank space between there, okay? So that's the behavior of the star. Suppose I want to write something out, and after I write that out, I'm going to write something else out, and I don't want the system to give me that automatic space. I use the keyword NoGap, no hyphen gap. So what's going to happen here is it's going to write out the word hello, and then it's not going to leave a gap after that, and whatever I ask to be written next will show up immediately after. So I have to be careful with where I put this in my program, because notice if I put no hyphen gap here, it'll take it just fine, but my output is unchanged. Where this would need to go is after hi, and you'll notice now I get rid of that space between. And just for clarity here, this no gap plays no role in the output we just looked at, okay? I get this right here. You might say, why do I care about this? In a later programming assignment, I'm going to have you write a real quick program that outputs a mailing label. And you know, hopefully, when you write a mailing label, you do city, comma, space, state. Well, if you have the name of a city stored in a variable, so you want to write out the city, and then immediately after the name of the city, you want to put a comma there, you don't want it to be city, space, comma. You want it to be city and the comma butting right up against it. How do you make that happen? NoGap is how you make that happen. So it's not something you'll use in every program, but it is actually used more commonly than you might be thinking at this point. I could do stuff like this. All this is a combination of the above techniques. So the slash to a new line if output has already been written. The 10 takes me to column 10. The 3 says write this out, only 3 characters wide, and then hello tells what to be written, and NoGap says don't put a space after it. So in this instance, what I'm going to actually see is HEL written out starting in column 10 with no space after it. There are all kinds of ways that the write statement can be used. We could spend 2 weeks just talking about the write statement, which neither I nor you want to do, okay? But this semester, I'm going to give you some programs that you'll have to figure out, okay, how do I want to create the output? And there'll be any number of different ways that you can do it, some of which might be really, really short blocks of code, and some of which might take you a lot more code to write if you're not writing it in the optimum way. The great thing about ABAP is, and hopefully you did this in your homework when I asked you to do it, is we have fantastic help built into ABAP. So notice here with my cursor blinking on the word write, if I hit the F1 key, it will pull up the keyword documentation. And if I look at documentation for the write statement, you'll notice what we talked about here. You know, here's NoGap, the at, which is the putting a number there. Here's the under that I talked to you about. But there's a lot of just really, really cool things here in the help, such as if you scroll down, it gives you source code, along with just incredible explanation of all kinds of different things here. You know, really robust help. And then this gets truncated for some reason on our display here. But for most of the help, you also have, in addition to what we're looking at here, and in addition to the fact that all these things that are underlined are hyperlinks that you can click on to take to other blocks of documentation, there's this guy right here, which is a syntax diagram, which shows up really, really tiny on our display here. But this shows you a diagram that shows you like all the different keywords that could be put together with a statement. But what I like right here is this part is really, really verbose, but there's a button here in the upper right called Quick Reference. And if I click on that, this just shows me all of the keywords that could be used in conjunction with the write statement. And what I do a lot of times is, like, let's say I give you a homework and I said, I want you to write out a number, and I don't want you to put a negative number next to a negative number. I just want you to write it out. And I don't want you to do any kind of function to do an absolute value. I just don't want you to output the negative sign. You might say, well, how do I do that? Well, if you pull up the right documentation, just start scanning through it. Look, there's an option there called no sign. That seems like it might have something to do with my particular problem. And now you can go and look for that in the documentation. Notice this, we have things like colors, where you can make the background different colors. You can make things bold, and you can put frames around things. And I mean, there's just a huge number of options here related to the write statement that we won't talk about, but you may want to use in your programs at some point this semester. And your best resource for figuring out how to do this is the ABAP documentation. I would suggest to you your second best option, in addition to reading your textbook, but it doesn't give you an abundance of examples, is Google is always good. You know, you can always Google things like ABAP, how do I, you know, and put in your question, and you may find yourself taken to a web page that gives you source code. But the keyword documentation that's built right into the system is really pretty fantastic. and I've not seen any other programming language that has that degree of explanation with it, where it gives all the source code. Questions? Okay. Chained statements. We will use this in a lot of different contexts this semester, but this is a great place for us to introduce it. Before I show you this slide, let's go back to this program right here, and let's play around with stuff that I'm sure you have done in other programming languages. For example, you might have in other programming languages written a line of code that looks something like this. You might notice that in ABAP, my comma there has been turned red. This is a syntactically invalid statement. And in fact, if I get rid of the comma, then I don't get anything that turns a particular color, but as we will see, this is a syntax error, because you'll notice it says unable to interpret hello. In other words, it's saying, I understand you want me to write out the word hi, but then I don't understand what's going on after that. We have not talked about how to write out variables yet, but if similarly I had a write statement and I put x comma y, intending for it to write out the contents of the variable x and the variable of the value of the variable y, syntax error. Can't write ABAP code that way. So what can we do? I can place a colon after a keyword that begins an ABAP statement. And what that does is now begin what is called the chained statement. A chained statement causes that same keyword to be repeated across multiple statements. So if you will, if you were writing down things on a piece of paper, you and I, if we were going to do this, probably a lot of you would understand what I meant by this right here, where I just put those what are commonly called ditto marks that's saying, okay, take what was above it and just copy it down to the next line. A chained statement gives me a way programmatically to do that same kind of thing. To have a statement and to take the keyword that begins that statement and say, hey, keep putting this on the next few lines of code until I tell you to stop. So I can't do this because write hello is a sentence. It's a full statement. It's a line of code on its own. And the world then, it has no idea what to do with that. So how do I fix it? That's one way I can fix it. This is actually two ABAP statements. If I put on the whiteboard what would be the equivalent of this, this is like saying write x, comma, y. And so what happens here is you notice I did a couple of things. I put a colon after the keyword, and then in place of where a period would normally go, on any intermediate statement, I put a comma. And then I put a period at the end of the chain that denotes that the chain is over. So of course I could have write colon and several things. And as long as all of them were separated by a comma, life is good, but then I have to end it with a period.
The modifiers that we talked about previously, those need to go to the right of the colon, and they could be different for each item in your series. Like, for instance, you could have a 5 before hello and a 10 before well.
Absolutely. Now, let's take this apart, because you asked a very, very good question that I was going to talk about in a couple seconds, but we might as well talk about it now. And let's play around with this a little bit in the ABAP editor to make sure that we see what's going on here. So this guy right here, if I wanted to fix him, put a colon in, so I'm off to a good start, but then I have to put a comma there as a separator. So the ABAP engine now sees this as write hi, write hello, end of chain. So I will save this and run it, and I get this right here, okay? I could similarly, I can keep going with my chain, comma, yeah, okay? I just keep going with the chain, and every time I put a comma in, what happens is at the beginning of the next portion, the keyword gets repeated. Okay, so let's observe this real quick, and then let's play around with what the question just asked. Suppose I wanted each of these words to be written out to a different line. Okay, I could do that. A few different ways I could do it. I could do this, right? Hi, hello, yeah, okay? Because what's going to happen is every time where after the comma, just whatever the keyword is to the left of the colon is going to get repeated. And so I get this right here. Now, if you really want to get fancy, though, you might say to yourself, well, look at that. There's a slash on every one of those lines. So can I only put a keyword to the left of a colon, or could there be more there than just the keyword? Well, I could do right slash and then bump off all of these guys right here because they're totally unnecessary at this point. And the idea is that whatever is to the left of the colon is going to get repeated at the beginning of each of the chained statements. And so I get this right here. Okay? So the idea is I can start a statement, really a code sequence. It could be a single word, or it could actually be multiple words, or it could be modifiers. And whatever I put to the left of the colon is going to get tacked onto all of the statements that are a part of that chain at the very beginning, and then the chain ends when we hit a period. Yes, sir?
Previously, you had said NoGap following the string. Could it proceed to
I don't. That's a real good question. Let's play around with that because I'm inclined to guess no. And here's a real good hint. You notice my code hinting didn't try and give me the word NoGap when I started typing it. That's probably a clue that this isn't going to work. Yeah, because NoGap, you'll recall, showed up at the end of the statement. But I could do, right, slash 5, colon. And so now it's going to go to a new line, except for the very first line, and it's going to go over to column 5. So the thing is, whatever I put there is what's going to go at the leftmost part of the chain. Okay? We will use this, as you can imagine, a lot. And in fact, we'll use it with more than just the right statement. You can do this with any particular ABAP statement in your programming. With right, here's a good rule of thumb. We want to follow the rule of thumb that one right statement is each line of output. And what I mean by that is, let's say we're going to write out a mailing label, like I mentioned a moment ago, and the mailing label will have the person's name, and let's assume, for sake of argument, that that's stored in 3 different variables: first name, middle initial, and last name. Well, what we would want to do is use one chained right statement to write out first name, middle initial, and last name. So one right statement would output this line right here. Then the next line, which would be the first line of their address, that would be a separate right statement. And then maybe there's another line, and then we have a line here that would be city, comma, state, zip. Well, this would be one chained write statement. But in general, what I've put here on the whiteboard would be 4 write statements. We wouldn't generally do one write statement chained to cover all of that, because our code would start to potentially be a little bit unmaintainable there. So I would do something like this, write, this is my first line of output. We haven't talked about how to write out variables, but there you go. That's how you would do it. And notice, in other programming languages, we write code like this all the time. The only way, though, for this to be a valid line of ABAP code is to use the chained write statement. Because without that colon there, as soon as the system hits this comma, it's not going to know what to do, and it's going to flag a syntax error.
So is your comma your concatenator? Or
It's a separator. Or more properly, it really is a terminator.
Okay.
It's terminate. This is 2 ABAP sentences that have been brought together for the sake of making my code less long. Okay. Other questions? All right. Right. This is now line 2, and you'll notice, by the way, that second write statement, that didn't need to be a chain statement. But there's really nothing wrong with this second line of code. And you may want to, write your code that way. I don't have a problem with it, realizing that what you have here is a chain statement that, if you will, only has one link in the chain. But that's fine. The key to remember is the chain ends when the system encounters its first period. That's what ends the particular chain. Okay? And here's the example that we put in the IDE a moment ago, where we put the slash to the left of the colon and have actually a chain statement. This is going to write, this is interesting, out to 3 different lines. Questions? Other useful output-related commands. If I try to write out a variable and I put no -0, that's going to output my var without leading zeros. We haven't yet talked about data types yet, but there are some numeric data types that have leading pack zeros, and you don't want that in your output. Think of like an old school odometer that was 0, 0, 0, 0, and then the number. Well, that's what we get. We write out certain data types in ABAP. If you don't want all those zeros, we just add no 0 to the modifier here. I'm not going to show you all of the different, these aren't actually the write statement, but they're things that I can put into my output to prettify it, to change the appearance. Uline will output a horizontal line. So for example, I could come here and I could do write what I have here, and then I can go to the next line and say uline, and then I can put in another write statement that just says Tuesday. And so what we're going to observe here is we just get a horizontal line in the output. Technically, that's not part of the write statement, but it does come in handy when we're building tables and we want to have like a header and then a line and then the guts of the table. I can also, technically you could do this, but it's really, really, really ugly. Don't do something like this, okay, to like really, really space out your code or space out your output. Oh, see, first of all, that didn't take that, I think. Yeah, I'd have to figure out what the way you could make that work is, but the point is you don't get multiple blank lines by just chaining together a bunch of slashes like that. If you want blank lines, use the skip statement. And you just put a number there. Skip and a number, and that'll just output that many blank lines. So I could come here and I could say, write hi, hello, yeah, write an underline, and then skip 5, and then write out Tuesday, and I'm going to get this right here. Okay, so that's how we introduce vertical white space, if that's something that's useful in the context of our program. We have just a few minutes left. Let's do one more slide to set ourselves up for our time together on Thursday. Before we do that, though, any questions about the right statement? All right, you're going to get lots of opportunity to practice with the right statement this semester. Variables. Let's talk about how we make variables in ABAP, how that works. Whenever we talk about creating a variable, we introduce the concept of a data type. A data type is simply a description of the kind of data a variable can hold. And you're familiar with that concept. It could be a string, it could be an integer number, it could be a number with a decimal portion. That's a data type. A data type describes the kind of data that a variable will hold. Be aware that a lot of people use the term data object as synonymous with variable. Same idea, just kind of a more fancy term. Doesn't imply object-oriented programming, just totally parallel to the terminology and concept of a variable. So what a data type does is it describes the kind of data a variable will hold, and may also control the range of acceptable values. Now, I don't know if you've seen this in any other programming languages, but what ABAP allows us to do is we could, of course, say, give me a variable called x, horrible name, but bear with me, give me a variable called x, and make it able to hold whole numbers. And in that case, of course, could store the number 17 or the number 54 or who knows what. Well, in ABAP, we have the ability to create our own custom data types and define that data to be whole numbers between 5 and 10. And in that instance, if x were of that data type, it could only be one of those 5 numbers. Well, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, one of those 6 numbers, 10. It couldn't hold 13. It couldn't hold 4. So data types carry with it not only a general description of the kind of data. Is it character data? Is it whole numbers? Is it integers? But also allows us to control things like the acceptable range of values. So a data type has both a technical meaning, it's a whole number, but it also may have a semantic meaning. For example, here at ETSU, you have a student ID number that's actually called, you call it an E number, that actually stands for an Edison number, and it always begins with the letter E, and then it's a string of I don't remember how many digits. Well, we could create a data type that was this. It began with the character E and then was followed by a certain number of digits, all of which would have to be 0 through 9. So you could not have as a valid E number E017T. That would be ruled out. So a data type gives us both a technical description, but a data type could have a semantic meaning to it. I could create a data type called Edison number. And if I created a data type I created a data object of the type Edison number, I would be picking up the semantic constraints of that concept. Now you think about what we might be doing in ABAP programming, where we could be storing things like employee numbers and account numbers and other things of that sort, where we might want to say things like an account number is always 6 digits long and it can't have any alphabetic characters in it. But in other cases, we might have things where we say this is always going to be 5 characters long, and it could be a mixture of letters and numbers, but letters can only appear in the first position or the last position. We can do things like that in ABAP with our data type definitions. So we have two concepts that go together here. We have a data type, which describes the data, and then we have a data object, which is based on that type, which is actually a region in memory that we're going to be able to use in the context of storing data in our program. Notice here that a data type could apply to a variable. Data type could also apply to a constant. We won't necessarily do a huge amount of work with constants this semester, but the concept is still the same. Well, this is where we are out of time for today. So